This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality. When he was 15, Fabian saw the film The 39 Steps, which had just come out. He liked to say that this film was a turning point in his life. It was an epiphany for him. As he left the cinema, he knew that he wanted to make films. It's likely that this is an embroidery of the truth, a constructive narrative to suit the persona he desired to project. There is nothing true about Fabian. True or not, he began to develop an interest in films at that time. He was familiar with John Buchan's book, The 39 Steps, and was fascinated by how Alfred Hitchcock had turned it into a film. The letters in the title had become numbers. He saw this as an example of the artistic benefits of technology, and the gears of his ambition were engaged. He was to become a film director. Fabian knew nothing about filmmaking, but that didn't discourage him. His patience was unlimited. He didn't care how long it took. It would, in fact, be only 6 years before he found himself looking out from behind a camera, sooner than he'd expected. He kept his new ambition to himself. His parents would not have approved. Arthur Davis thought a career in accounting, or ideally a position in the civil service, was the obvious direction he should take. His mother, Virginia, didn't care, but wouldn't have approved of anything he said he wanted to do. So he spent the next 6 years plotting and trying to teach himself about filmmaking, which meant reading everything he could get his hands on about the subject, which was not much. Later, he was influenced by Eisenstein's film form and film sense. He also went to the cinema as much as he could, sometimes going back to see the same film many times. He found that with multiple viewings, his initial emotional involvement fell away, leaving him able to dispassionately observe how the film was put together. Ironically, he would have made a good accountant or civil servant. He had the brain and temperament for it, as Mercury in Capricorn conjunct to the moon makes clear. But these influences were offset by both Neptune and Jupiter in Leo in the 8th house, which, among other things, suggest an affinity for arts and entertainment. At university, he got involved with the theatre, and when he became friends with Helen, a fellow student, she introduced him to the films of Dali and Buñuel, L'Âge d'Or and Un Chien Andalou. Helen was interested in modern art. Most of it was happening across the Channel in Paris at the time. They talked about going there. The Buñuel-Dali films opened up a new realm of possibilities for Fabian, widening his awareness of what he could do and taking him beyond the dramas of suspense that had enthralled him. Portraying life as a dream state made all kinds of directions possible. He still liked suspense, but realized that it didn't have to be rooted in an orthodox perception of reality. The surrealist films were not particularly suspenseful, relying more on the strategy of shock. The images of the blade across the eyeball, the donkey hauling the piano, and the ants crawling from a wounded palm were shocking indeed, but they also struck him as brittle in a way. They didn't have the depth or irony of drama. Shock always requires more shock, as the audience becomes inured to it, and is therefore ultimately unfulfilling. He also felt there was a certain self-righteousness to these films, as if the director assumed he knew better or more than other people. Fabian suspected that no one really knew anything. There was no room for self-righteousness in the world. It was a piece of wisdom one might normally have associated with an older person. Louis Buñuel might have been shocked himself to find his films appreciated by the sequacious bourgeoisie he was trying to insult. As the stars have shown, Fabian was very focused and ambitious. He knew what he wanted and pursued it with tact but without compromise. Though he never assumed that his ideas were the only valid or correct ones. They pertained to himself. Other people had just the same right to their different opinions as he did. One evening, at a pub in Cambridge, he was involved in a conversation about the theory of relativity. Simon Beale was reading physics and took it on himself to explain Einstein's theory to a gaggle of would-be thespians and literature students. Simon was enjoying his position of superior knowledge, but he was also a good teacher. Despite his clear explanations, most of what he said went over Fabian's head, except for one phrase, extended present. The juxtaposition of those two words excited him, without even knowing what was meant, and he perked up. Before that, he'd been distracted by a game of shove-halfpenny. He'd been trying to think of all the different names for the ancient game. Shufflegroat, Shovilleboard, Slide-thrift, Slippergroat, and then extended present. His attention had snapped back. Simon continued his lecture. Most people understand time as what has happened, what is happening now, and what will happen, past, present, and future. But Einstein's special theory of relativity shows that this is not the case. There's an intermediate state, neither past nor future, the extended present. Its duration increases with distance from the observer. At close up, that duration is so short that it cannot be perceived by human senses. But if you were to observe an event in a precise moment of time from the moon, the extended present would last a few seconds. And if you went further out to Mars, it would be 15 minutes. So in this moment that you think of as now, some things would have already happened, and others would be yet to come. A moment cannot be objectively perceived or described. Fabian was floored. There is no such thing as now. That's the way he saw it. The realization was thrilling. It had the ring of poetry and stayed with him always. No sooner had it sunk in than he began to explore ways he could use the idea. In a general sense, film suggested a linear progression of time. Footage of celluloid passed from one spool to another, in camera and projector, each frame moving sequentially through the gate. There was no movement of the images themselves. Only the medium that contained the still images moved. It was an archaic trick like the zoetrope. It seemed a crude mechanism when compared to the concept of the extended present. If one slowed or stopped the film running through the projector, causing the film to melt and the screen to portray bubbling celluloid, could that represent the extended present? Not really. It might be better achieved by having two actors experience a different duration of the same scene. He could imagine filming an actor who sat in a cinema watching the screen on which he was portrayed sitting in the cinema and watching the screen. But that was more Escher than extended present. It was a difficult concept to express visually. In the future, the process of filmmaking would be much more sophisticated. Celluloid would no longer be needed. The images themselves might move, just like reality. Cameras would be no different than eyes. They would have perception. He was naturally inclined to technology and things mechanical, as Uranus in the second house and Mars in the ninth might attest. Fabian grew up in turbulent times, as does everyone, because all times are turbulent. The only modifier being one's proximity to a turbulent zone and its intensity. As the motions toward war began to fester in Europe, he was enjoying himself at university. It was probably the first protracted period of enjoyment in his life, a newfound liberty from the drabness and solitude of his childhood, which, up until then, he'd considered the normal state of affairs. He had only lived a fraction of his life. Most of it was still ahead of him. Hope and excitement were a matter of course. So Fabian was not unduly concerned with the impending war. He had been relatively unscathed by the Great Depression due to his father's dry but steady employment in the mid to upper rungs of the civil service. It was perhaps due to his father's irrational and implacable hatred of the Irish that he immersed himself in the tales of Irish myth, the stories of Cuchulainn being his favourite. Cuchulainn was born with the name Setanta. His mother was Diechtin, the sister or daughter of Trachud mac Nessa, the king of Ulster. His father was the god Lugh. There are different versions of the story of his birth. They all involve a group of Ulstermen out hunting for magical birds when they are forced to take shelter from a sudden snowstorm. In one version, Diechtin rides with them. In another, she is the wife of the man who hosts them for the night, presumably the god Lugh. Either way, she becomes pregnant and gives birth to Setanta. What immediately strikes me about this are the magical birds, the common thread between the different versions. They become a metaphor, just hinted at, an undercurrent of birds. It makes me think there should be subterranean stories written beneath this one, like a succession of ancient cities that lie beneath each other, deeper and deeper into the past. It would be built from symbols rather than words, images of birds perhaps. Those birds would have to fly at such a great depth that they would barely be noticeable. How would they connect with the story on the surface? It would have to be a courtship, playful and coy. The different stories must desire each other. Kulan was a smith whose house was guarded by a ferocious dog. Setanta killed it in self-defense, and when Kulan was upset about it, Setanta had to take its place until a suitable canine replacement could be found. Thenceforth he was known as Kukulan, Kulan's hound. He had black hair. In other versions of the story he was blonde, or had hair which was brown, red and yellow in different layers. Fabian liked to think of him with dark hair. He had black hair himself, and piercing blue eyes, like a Siberian husky. People found them shocking to look at. Attractive, yet vaguely repellent. One's gaze kept returning to them, along with the desire to look away. Fabian's eyes gave him an edge. He had other similarities with the hero. Both were handsome, diminutive in stature, boyish in appearance, beardless, and had many lovers. Kukulan was renowned for his extreme battle frenzy. The tendons in his neck would bunch up into great knots bigger than babies' heads. One eye would come out of its socket and rest on his cheek. The other would be sucked back into his skull. His lungs and kidneys were visible in his throat. He would kill everything in sight, friend or foe, it made no difference. It took scores of women bearing their breasts in front of him to distract him long enough to allow the other men to cool him off in successive barrels of water. This was where their similarities ceased. When Fabian was at school, he had to do mandatory military training in the cadet forces for several hours each Wednesday afternoon. Every now and then that meant bayonet practice. The boys would be lined up on the edge of a field. When the command to fix bayonets came, they twisted their mean 17-inch blades onto the ends of their rifles in the prescribed manner and stood at attention. Then one at a time they would be called upon to run 20 yards across the field towards an upright bale of hay. They were instructed to emit blood-curdling screams as they ran. When they reached the target, they would thrust the bayonet into the bale, twist it to the right and left, then putting a foot against the hay belly, they would pull out the blade and run back. Despite his best efforts, Fabian's blood-curdling screams were never more than whimpers. He was not to be a hero. This was the result of Mars in Libra. He hated confrontation and always fell back on persuasion and tact to further his aims. The Irish stories offered him relief from Greco-Roman thought. The Romans never reached Ireland. Irish logic was different from Roman logic. It had been mitigated by Christian missionaries, perhaps, but had still managed to maintain some independence. He was sceptical of such opinions, even when they were his own. They would have to be proven true, and the proofs required for that would have to be proven themselves, and so on, a never-ending requirement of proof. This is an example of the regressive argument in epistemology. It is one part of the Munchausen trilemma, which seeks to demonstrate the impossibility of proving any truth. The other two parts of the trilemma are circular argument and dogmatic argument. Despite his grace and intelligence, Fabian was so private about his inner feelings, even to himself, that it was almost as if he didn't have any. It would take years for him to open up. But that kind of extreme reserve was cultural for a man of his time and class, raised in an all-male boarding school. The famous exchange between Lord Uxbridge and the Duke of Wellington, at the moment that Uxbridge was hit in the leg by a cannon shot, sums it up perfectly, even if it never happened. "By gad, sir, I've lost my leg. says Uxbridge. Wellington replies, "By gad, sir, so you have." The amputated limb became a tourist attraction in the village of Waterloo in Belgium.
That was Fabian, written and read by Tom Newton. This is an excerpt from Tom Newton's novel, Fabian, A Cubist Biography. Recital Publishing, 2025. Well, the first thing we need to do today is change your hat. Here, take off your host hat and put on this guest hat.
My hat? Oh, you had me there for a moment. I didn't think I was wearing one. I don't usually wear a hat inside. You were talking metaphorically. How's that for intelligence? Okay, I'll take it off and put on the new one. How do I look?
You look pretty much the same, but now there's a difference in what goes on under the hat.
I think this might be more of a helmet than a hat.
We just heard an excerpt from the beginning of your new novel, Fabian, A Cubist Biography. Congrats on getting it finished and out into the world. I know it's been in the works for a while.
Well, thanks. You know, I think I started it in 2020, so it's been 5 years in the making. I feel like a different person now.
I'm a different person since 2020 as well.
I can
but
tell.
That's a different story. I'm quite interested in the origins of this Fabian project in your mind. I think that essentially you set yourself an artistic challenge without preconceived notions of story or character. In other words, not at all like the origins of most novels. Can you say more about that?
Well, it began as an experiment, a kind of game, and I didn't know where it would lead. I wanted to try and write something using the Fibonacci sequence. I began the sequence with 1 and 2, as did Fibonacci, I believe. Some people begin at 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, but for my purposes I had to begin it with 1 because you can't have a sentence with no words. The idea was that the lower Fibonacci numbers would define the number of words in a sentence, and then as they rose, in paragraphs and then in chapters. So my first sentence had to have 1 word. It's tricky trying to think of a 1-word sentence to begin a book. The word biography popped into my mind. I think it began, the first sentence, biography, the second, of whom, the third, of a man, and fourth, someone I knew nothing about. After I reached the 17th step in the sequence, the number 2584,
Whoa.
I found I was putting more thought into the word count than what I was actually writing, and I was beginning to feel like a contortionist, so I gave it up. It's amazing how quickly the numbers become huge. I threw most of what I'd written away, but I was left with the idea it had brought me, a biography of a man I knew nothing about. Perhaps the name Fabian came from Fibonacci, via the subconscious.
Wow, I didn't expect all that. I thought you were going to say something about astrology.
Well, I was making my winding way to that. Traditional biographers research their subjects, but you can't do research into someone who never existed. And I didn't want to just imagine a character in the way most novelists would. I wanted someone I knew nothing about and had nothing to do with. Astrology seemed the perfect way to create him. I came up with a birth date, place, and time of birth, and had a horoscope cast. Then I bought some books on astrology and attempted to interpret it. I describe all this in the book. But there's a discrepancy between the me talking to you here about this process and the me who's talking about it in the book.
Mm-hmm.
I was tempted to interfere with my claimed pristine and voluntary ignorance. I wanted Fabian to be a film director, and so, for the fun of it, I gave him the same birth date and year of birth as Fellini, though not the same time or place. Interestingly, things came up in his chart, like Jupiter in Leo, Uranus in Aquarius, and the moon in the first house. All things that suggested great public acclaim, especially associated with arts and entertainment. So, make of that what you will.
Well, I like the way you insert the novel's artistic aims and your process into the actual text of the novel. In Chapter 1, Fabian does not yet exist. He's in the process of being invented by a first-person narrator that we understand to be you, the author. But as you just hinted at, once we pass the title page, all bets are off. Even the I who seems to be you may be fictional. So you've placed a metafictional frame around the story. This reminded me of Ingmar Bergman's handling of Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute. We see the outside of the theater and the audience members, the proscenium, and even the actors backstage are all occasionally seen. But in between, we're fully present in the scenes with the characters.
I think the idea was not just to have a fictitious biography, but to describe the thought process behind it, to have someone write it. So it was purposefully metafictional from the start. You have the writer's thoughts and the biography. That's what makes it a novel in a way, not a standard biography, a cubist novel as I described it, because you see the different perspectives simultaneously.
Yeah.
By writing myself into the story, I became no more nor less real than the other characters. I assume I'm real, of course, as I imagine you do.
Some people think, quote, authorial intrusion, end quote, is a horrible thing, downright immoral.
Well, it depends upon one's relationship with the text.
Yeah.
If you want to get lost in a story, in an escapist way perhaps, not that there's anything wrong with that, then you might find authorial intrusion annoying and alienating. But now that we've had 70 years or so of postmodernism, text can be appreciated in a different way. I don't ascribe to the relativism of postmodernism. Maybe it's responsible for the mess we find ourselves in these days.
Yes.
One may only be able to perceive a personal truth, but that doesn't necessarily mean there is no such thing as objective truth. But I like the way postmodernism has widened the way we can relate to a text. It's a matter of personal taste, really.
In this excerpt we just heard, the authorial intrusion is rather subtle. There are objective comments here and there about history and culture. Then there are the sudden strange mentions of astrology as the reasons for Fabian's actions. A first-person pronoun only pops up once, in which you, not really you, mention your interest in the magical birds in the Irish myth. But all this reminds us that we're in a constructed story. The subtlety, the hinting, it's very well managed. How calculated was that? Or did it come naturally?
It wasn't particularly calculated, not at first. I had different feelings about the book while I was writing it. Sometimes I liked it and was carried away with enthusiasm. Sometimes I hated it or found it boring. Sometimes I wanted to throw it away, but felt obligated to continue. I'd invested so much it seemed stupid to abandon it. That's a critical reason given for the collapse of civilizations, by the way, not being able to abandon things that have been invested in, even when they're detrimental. Sometimes I got stuck or blocked. In these cases, I would write notes to myself about how I felt. Then I got the idea to incorporate these notes into the text and began to do it more deliberately, but it was unconscious at first.
I don't want to give away too much of the story, but what about the whole ancient Mexico part? Aztecs and conquistadors. What inspired that?
I've always been interested in the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish, seeing it as a pivotal moment in history. Had it not happened, things would be quite different today. I used to imagine making a film about it, but it was beyond me and I never worked out how to do it anyway. It's much easier to write about making a film than to actually make one, so I thought I'd have Fabian do it, seeing as he was going to become a great film director.
Okay.
The trouble was that, just like me, he could never work out how to do it, and he never made the film. And like me, he had the idea to create his principal character by using astrology. Unlike me, Fabian's character, also called Fabian, though pronounced in the Spanish way, Fabian, and written with an accent on the final A, went on to lead his own independent life in New Spain. And that's how the parallel story came about. It's unrelated to the other one, but both stories are linked by two immortal characters who cross over between them.
Isn't it against the official rules of fiction to have a character invent other characters?
I don't know. But what are rules if not to be broken? Just as belief can't come without doubt, rules can't exist without being broken. I think these kinds of things have a symbiotic relationship with their opposites.
And you've also got a lot of other stuff in there. World War II and post-war era London, Victorian era New York City, psychiatry and drugs, immortal magicians, love stories, astrology, film history, footnotes, appendices, and, as might be expected, invented history. This would appear to be the result of a great deal of wide-ranging study. Are you a polymath?
I wouldn't go so far as to claim that, but I like to follow my interests wherever they happen to take me, as do most people, I imagine. What else have we got, aside from love and curiosity?
Yeah. And what's up with those photographs that appear here and there?
Well, in traditional biographies, there are quite often 2 or 3 sections that consist of a few pages of photographs. I thought it would be good to do that in this book, to give it the veneer of biography. But I realized I'd have to find a way to amass a slew of anonymous photos from the correct era, and it all became a bit daunting. I suppose I could have used AI to generate them, but I wasn't about to do that.
Good.
Then I began to think that something more surreal would be better suited. I was influenced and inspired by W.G. Sebald, whose books contain rather odd and low-resolution photos that don't seem to have anything to do with what he's writing about. My friend, the photographer Finn Riley, kindly allowed me to use some of his photos. There are 9 in the book. His eye and sensibility go very well with the story, I think. And while I'm thanking Finn for his generosity, I should also thank you for all the effort and time you've put into the book. I really appreciate everything you've done. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was fun. So, okay, for our listeners, Fabian, A Cubist Biography, is available online in the usual places, in paperback, ebook, and audiobook formats. You can get the paperback through bookstores as well, or directly from Recital Publishing, which is a great way to support our efforts. Just go to recitalpublishing.com for all the options. Tom, are you working on any new projects?
I've been slowly putting together another book of short stories, which I think will be called The Right Moment and Other True Stories. I'm not sure when it will be done.
One last thing. Right near the beginning of the excerpt we just heard is this sentence. There is nothing true about Fabian. What about you? Is there a character somewhere who made you up?
Well, that person's sitting right here. You made me up. I'm a character in one of your books. It's a pleasure to finally meet you.
You've been listening to The Strange Recital on the web at thestrangerecital.com. Music on this episode was The Other Side of Never by XJ5000. This was episode 25021.